Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. It is day 4,519 of us being in business. I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell, and tonight we are honored to host Nick Flynn, the author of the memoir, This is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire. He's going to be in conversation with Natasha Trethewey, the acclaimed poet and author of her own memoir, Memorial Drive. We are noting that tonight is a Zoom webinar. We do not have cameras and speakers available, but you can ask your question, cameras and microphone available. You can ask your questions in Q&A, and we will get to as many as we can. So Publishers Weekly called the new book an outstanding in a starred review, and in Kirkus, they wrote, memoir is a genre of complicity, a form that thrives on questions and filling in the gaps, especially when information is conjectural or scant. Flynn plunges headlong into such territory, endowing his book with a palpable sense of risk. It is a remarkable and daring work, a song of both family and self. Nick Flynn, and I apologize, I always get the numbers wrong in these sort of things. Nick Flynn is the author of 3 previous memoirs, including the Penn Joyce Osterwell award-winning Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, 4 volumes of poetry, most recently My Feelings, and 2 plays. He's a professor of creative writing at the University of Houston. Natasha Trethewey is the former U.S. Poet Laureate and the author of 5 collections of poetry, including the Pulitzer Prize winning book Native Guard, as well as the memoir Memorial Drive. Her awards include the Guggenheim Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and National Endowment for the Arts, as well as her Harvard Radcliffe Institute, where she was a Bunting Fellow. She's currently the Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. We are honored to have you both here. Thank you so much. Virtual applause all around. Well,
thank you, Daniel. I just want to say thanks to you, to Boswell Book Company, and to Natasha. It's so great to have you here. I really am honored and thrilled, and we've known each other a long time. And yeah, I just can't wait. I've just been living with your books this past couple months, so which is really a pleasure. So we're going to start out tonight. We're thinking of having Natasha read a little bit, and then I'm going to read a little bit, and then we'll talk a little, and then we'll both read probably a little bit again, and then talk a little more. But all the time, though, feel free to ask questions. Put questions in the chat, in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them as we can. Maybe we'll just get to them as we go along. So I'll just pass it to you, Natasha.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Nick and I talked a little bit about this just before, and so I thought that I would read just about a page and a half from the second chapter of the book that's called Terminus. For a long time, I tried to forget as much as I could of the 12 years between 1973 and 1985. I wanted to banish that part of my past, an act of self-creation by which I sought to be made only of what I chose consciously to remember. I chose to mark the calendar year just after my mother and I left Mississippi as ending, and the moment of loss, her death, as beginning. Those 2 years would be like the set of bookends I'd kept on my desk back then, 2 small globes imprinted with a sepia map of the world, bracketing a few favorite volumes, Wuthering Heights, The Great Gatsby, Light in August. In my attempt at willed forgetting, I would collapse the distance between bookends, the year that ended the world of my happy early childhood, pressing right up against the new world I'd entered suddenly as a motherless child. The years 1973 and 1985, side by side, with no books between them, no pages upon which the story I could not bear to remember had been written. But there is a danger in willed forgetting. Too much can be lost. It's been harder for me to call back my mother when I've needed to most. Of course, we're made up of what we've forgotten too, what we've tried to bury or suppress. Some forgetting is necessary, and the mind works to shield us from things that are too painful. Even so, some aspect of trauma lives on in the body from which it can reemerge unexpectedly. Even when I was trying to bury the past, there were moments from those lost years that kept coming back, rising to mind unbidden. Those memories, some intrusive, some lovely, seem now to have a grander significance, like signposts on a path. It's a path I can see now only because I followed it backward, attempting to find a moment of revelation, evidence of something being set in motion. There's a scene like that from the first few months after my mother and I moved to Atlanta. It is winter, early evening, and I am watching as she changes out of the clothes she's worn to class and dresses for work. I can see her from the space that is my room, a closet off her bedroom, barely large enough to hold my twin bed. The daffodils I picked for her on the way home from school are doubled in the mirror on her dresser. I watch her as the sky goes dark, street lamps just coming on outside the small window above me. There must be someone else in the apartment, someone there to watch over me while she is gone, but I don't remember that part. I know only that I will sleep, and in the morning she will be there again. So I stay awake until she leaves, wearing the uniform required for her job as a cocktail waitress in underground Atlanta. Black leotard and jeans, a heavy brass bullet belt slung low around her slender hips. I see it so clearly now. My young mother bending to kiss me, the bullet's cold metal brushing my hand, her body ringed in the objects of her undoing.
I just want to jump in and just start talking about this actually, about this piece, this beautiful piece. I'm going to read a short, I'm going to read one short piece too after this, but sort of to line our mothers up, to put them next to each other in some way, if that's possible. But this cathectic object, this image of this brass belt with the bullets, this very particular object that then, becomes, as you say, her body ringed in the objects of her undoing. When I read that, I was just like, just so stunned by it. Just the way the world lined up in that moment and your memory lined up to bring that to the page and to sort of see that as a thing. Because this belt appears other places in the book too, at least one other place, doesn't it? Like maybe twice. It's like, it's something you return to, which I think is, say something, yeah.
Well, yeah, I noticed that same kind of thing. It was one of the notes I put down about your book. That felt to me like the need to sort of make these connections, or just how we just see these patterns emerging, which is such a necessity for me. And that's, the belt is one of the things that I carried around for a while with me until I let go of it.
And you held on to that object for so long. Wow.
Yeah.
How did you let it go?
Well, it seems very silly, and maybe it still exists out there. My last quarter in college, I moved into my cousin's house in Atlanta. She's still her parents' house. And I took with me all the things that I had been holding on to of my mother's, and the belt was one of them. And so it was in boxes in her parents' garage. And then when I moved out and went to graduate school, I didn't retrieve those boxes.
Yeah.
So by now, they've perhaps thrown them away.
It was time to let it go. And just the idea of like this object that appears, that threads through a book also. This is Natasha's book. It just came out in paperback, right? Just a couple months ago. Yeah. And it's, that's one of the reasons we're here. My book came out in paperback, but Natasha's, the reason I wanted to talk to Natasha is
I don't have the paper, I have the hardcover.
Yeah. Well, it looks the same. I have the hardcover too in front of me. The reason I wanted to talk is just because, with both of our books, this is really the book about my mother. Like Another Bullshit Night in Suck City is the book about my father. And it took me a long time to get to this book, to really get to sort of, underneath the story underneath the story. I'm not sure if that's particular to mothers or just like how it, but you're working on your father book though now. You're working on your biological father book.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's the only father I have in my mind,
Yeah.
my biological father.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah. But I was just clarifying that. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Who you have written about in poems. I mean, you have like some poems about your
Yeah, my book Thrall was the beginning of that, of trying to have this conversation with my father in poems.
and
But
Enlightenment.
now,
Yeah, the poem Enlightenment, where you go to Monticello with him. Yeah.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
But when you and I first met, I think it was exactly 21 years ago.
Yeah.
We read together in Cambridge. That was when I was at Radcliffe.
Yeah.
And Grey Wolf, I guess, put us together to give a reading. And I don't know, I hope the audience will understand this is the trauma survivors kind of joke, but we joked that it was the dead mother, absent father tour. Remember that?
I forgot that, but it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, because then we did go on tour. I mean, we were also in Minneapolis together too, or up somewhere. I remember we went shopping in a mall. We went to a mall.
Oh yeah, that terrible strip mall.
Yeah, to go to a strip mall. We were so bored. We were like in a hotel, and we were trying to figure out what to do with ourselves. Yeah. But yeah, and that's when you were talking about this book, though. You talked about this book or your need to write about your mother back then, 21 years ago. And I'm just so, I knew this book would come. I knew this book was coming. And
yeah, I mean, even though, I knew that there was this thing that I needed to deal with, I wasn't ever sure that I would actually really write this book. And so, my reason for doing it, and I want to ask you about this, about how because you've just been saying how hard it was to finally come to writing about the mother. I think that was hard for me too, I think, but perhaps for slightly different reasons.
Yeah. They're very different. They're very different
I felt the need to do it just because my mother I felt like she was being erased and diminished in her role as the person who made me a writer, or the reason that I'm a writer, the wound out of which I write. So I felt that I needed to tell that and to have her stop being referred to as an afterthought, as this victim, as this murdered woman.
Yeah.
But your coming to this is different. Would you talk about that?
Yeah. It's funny because my mother has appeared in probably every one of my books in some ways, a glimpse of her, a scene, poems about her. And the early ones would more be about, trying to balance that line between, you don't want to just write about the tragedy. So you want to sort of have some time before the tragedy. So that people know who she is, so what was lost. So I tried to write poems, but at the beginning it was probably hard to do because I was really caught in the trauma of her suicide. And then in Another Bullshit Night in Sex City, like even when they made the film of it, the director, Paul Weitz, pointed out that the thing about that was like she's not a big part of the film. Like Julianne Moore plays my mother in that film. And she was only there very briefly, there's a few minutes in the film, but she's like the force that animates everything. Like she animates my father, what he's doing, why we get together, what we're trying to wrestle, what we're trying to talk about. Like she is the force. And so at some point he had her be this ghostly presence in the shelter. Like just sort of, we could both sort of see this ghostly presence of her walking, which I thought was quite something film could do, that we try to do in writing, and, different mediums have different possibilities. And then, so this last book though, was really trying to like go even more deeply into it and trying to really sort of see the full complexity of her, and not to either just have it be pure tragedy or have it be pure romanticized vision of her, but just to sort of have the fullness of her. And part of that came from also, just aging too, like me getting older and being able to sort of see, like maybe have some forgiveness or compassion for certain things I couldn't look at when I was younger. But then also having, the story is that she set our house on fire when I was 6. it is a story. I'm not 100% sure it's true, but it actually lines up with reality. It lines up with, I can imagine it being true. I don't know. I can't know for sure. There's things we can't know for sure.
Right.
But what hit me was like before my mother was, before I had a daughter, I have a daughter, and when my daughter turned 6, 7, I began to sort of get in a very strange space, a very strange headspace, because I realized like the fire was still sort of burning in the back of my head. And then I saw my daughter and I was like, well, that's a really strange thing to do with a kid in the house. And the strange thing is that I didn't know that. I couldn't really put that together until I saw my daughter that age. Like I just kind of thought it was a cool story and a cool thing my mother did, because we got the insurance money, we got the house renovated, but then I was like, but that's so dangerous. Like to set a house on fire with kids in it is like really dangerous, So, and so
when I first got your book and I saw the title, I put it, there's many bookshelves in here. This is my study. There's a library, but then there's a living room where there's a whole nother wall of books. And I put it right there in the center of that wall of books so that I would see the title and could like make myself at some point read it. And I hadn't read it yet until we finally were going to do this. And I think maybe that was because, I don't know if you know this, but, my house burned in 2017. So I do mention the fire in this book, but just even your descriptions and the sort of extended metaphor of, what someone's house being on fire, and then the reality of smoke, and that feeling of not being able to ever not smell the smoke anymore. I mean, our renovation is totally different than how you describe yours. They did all these things to get rid of it, and it was a complete gut renovation, and all of our possessions were gone, for the most part. But just the other day, it got really hot in Chicago, and there's a house was built in 1897. So there's the original huge fireplace, wooden carved thing. They managed to save that. And the house was heated up, and I walked by it several times and I kept smelling smoke. And it occurred to me that, my literal mind thinks, okay, so the house is so heated up that this fireplace is now giving off this smell of smoke again. Or am I just, is it coming back in another kind of way? But I mean, reading your book, I thought about, did that happen? Did she do this? How do you, and then there was the whole insurance thing. I mean, I was thinking about all the kind of weird practical stuff about it. Like, how do you do that? How do you, but I'm going to stop saying this, but the last thing I want to tell you is just sort of the way that, your mind attaches to certain things. And this is the part that I wrote about in the book. Our house burned on Thanksgiving Day. And the day before I was working on this memoir, and I was trying to write about in the chapter from that I just read from, my mother and I arriving in Atlanta when we moved there, and the car catching on fire. And, so I was just going online to do, research, about, how a car engine might catch on fire or whatever. And then the next day my house burns, and I just thought, somehow you almost will certain things into happening because you're thinking about them so much. I was thinking about fire, and then the next thing you know, fire.
I don't think of myself as
superstitious.
Yeah, I'd say suspicious, but superstitious a person. But I've had things like that happen when I had a big performance due last year, right when COVID hit, or a year and a half ago now. Which was on Blake's Apocalyptic Visions. We're going to do this big performance of Blake's Apocalyptic Visions down in Houston. And it was about, the end of the world and fire and things. And then as we were about to do it, COVID hit, and it's just like this apocalypse came, and it's like, you got to be careful. I think you do have to be careful in some way, and it's going to,
even as you say, you're not superstitious. I said suspicious. I see, but you're drawing all those connections, the need to make those things line up is what I identified so much with.
Yeah, and I think that's what happens when you're in a project too. Like everything starts to speak to you. Like the whole, it's like that. Adrian Rich has a quote about that. Like when you're in the middle of something, it's like constant bombardment all the time. Like these sort of, you're in the middle of a windstorm and everything's connecting to you.
Yeah.
Everything that comes around connects to you, which is, sort of the wonderful thing about being in a project, and also the terrible thing. Like right now I'm not in a project, which I feel wonderful because I'm not like, I'm not trying to, like, not everything in the world has this significance and has like sort of is suddenly fitting into a big puzzle that's like of madness that's going on. So
well, you were going to read.
Yeah, let me read a little something, because I'm just thinking of, I'll read a little bit about the fire, a little short piece that ended up being both in this book and in my last book of poetry too. I wrote about the fire in one way that it just seemed to work, and it seemed like a poem, so I put it in both books. No one so far seemed to notice. So it's called What You Can't Hear. The child looks back at the window of the room he's just fled, each pane now filled with sparks, each spark one of his toys. Monkey spark, matchbox spark, yo-yo spark. It was the smoke that woke him, nothing else. When he woke, the air was smoke, but now it is studded with sparks. Lightning bugs, he thinks. My room is filled with lightning bugs. Mom in her bathrobe, Vernon in his boxers, sparks swirl around their words. The child wants to run back inside, but he cannot. His feet sink into the lawn. The trees reflect the house now, their leaves illuminated from below, like the palms of gospel singers. When does a lightning bug become a firefly, he wonders. Years later, he will be in bed beside a woman, and he will tell her about the fire. We all made it out okay, he tells her, his eyes still studded with sparks. But when she reaches for him, it is with hands of smoke, as if the smoke were a cloud in his lungs, as if too much dark lived there. Outside his window, it's that tree again, singing. What you can't hear is the light caught in each bud. What you can't hear is the leaves inside each bud. That's a little shorty. And I was thinking, also, like when we were talking before, there was a thing about with your house fire. We have a moment in this book too, where I get to the point where I forget the job I had. I'd forgotten the job I had when I was just out of high school, which was cleaning houses. And one of the jobs we would do, a big main job, was to clean houses after fires and to go into them. And with these, we had these strange chemical sponges that we would just like wipe on the walls, and all the soot would just go away off the walls. It would sort of absorb all the soot into this, they're probably very toxic sponges.
Yes, right.
But it's just like, it's strange like that. Like that's one of the connections too, that sort of comes back, like, why would that? And that seemed to be that job made a lot of sense to me. Like it really made a sense that you could put the house back together again after it caught fire, and there's a house on fire, like in every one of my books actually too, like a little glimmer of it, a little, like there's always a house burning. So this is when I decided to go into the house. I'm going to read one more short piece too. This is also, like, I was thinking about you when you were going into Atlanta in the car, and your mother in her lime green jumpsuit waiting on the side of the road, to have the car fixed to get into Atlanta, which I think is where you were living when we met. I think you were living in Atlanta.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's called Antigone. My mother and I are driving down a highway. So this is several years after the fire. This is almost 8 years after the fire, and she's not in a good place. So my mother and I are driving down a highway. I'm 15. It's the middle of the day. I don't know where we are going. My mother is in another hard place. Travis has just vanished. She's cut off all her hair, lost a lot of weight. I'm beside her, and though we have nowhere to be, she apparently misses our exit. As we pass it, she remembers and cuts the wheel sharply, so sharply the whole car goes into a spin, once, twice, like slow motion. I look at her as we spin. I never say a word. We end up stalled, nose pointing into the oncoming traffic. Cars sound like sirens as they swerve around us. She holds on to the wheel. I look at her. A man presses his face to his window, tomato red, close enough to touch, laying on his horn as he sails past. Death is but a moment that returns forever. We sit for a long moment like that, listening to the horns. Then I reach out and touch her shoulder. She half glances at me, reaches for the key, turns the ignition. The engine struggles, then catches. Shitbox. She puts it in gear, gives me a wild-eyed look, as if asking if we should just keep going, gun it into the oncoming traffic. I look back at her, calm, as if we have all the time in the world. A car passes close by my window, laying on the horn. We're okay, I say, and point toward the exit, as if it were just one of many options. And it takes a little line in there. The death is but a moment that returns forever is a little line from Anne Carson's translation of Antigone, which I got to see again, like one of those things where in the middle of writing this book, in the years, the 5 some odd years it took to write this book, I went and saw Anne Carson's Antigone, and suddenly that it was everywhere. Like that, you see things everywhere when you're in the middle of a project. Yeah. Yeah.
Cover story.
A cover
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have
when
a
you
cover story? Do you want to talk about that? So the cover story is, should we say what a cover story is for those who haven't read the book?
Yeah. Well, so, you talk about the cover story being sort of the narrative that you shape to be able to tell something about the trauma that is not exactly the deeper, more complex nature of the trauma.
Yeah.
Am I getting that right? Is there another way you would describe it?
That sounds good. I think it comes from PTSD studies of like Vietnam vets, and like that, when you talk to someone who's been in the war, they come home and they'll tell you some sort of version of something that doesn't touch on the true horror of it. And because it's too,
Right.
you need to say something, and usually it's something a little funny, often it's something a little funny, they can couch it, but it allows you to sort of be part of society, I think, still. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about the cover story. This is kind of hard, sorry. Well, as many places that the books kind of converge, one of the things that was particularly wounding to me about yours, sorry, is that you say that the cover story you'd been telling yourself was that it was okay because you had felt very loved.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly true. That was just the cover story.
Yeah. Or yes, I'm so moved that you're moved by it.
Sorry.
No, I'm very
Well,
no,
that,
I apologize. Yeah.
oh, you just went away. Well, I think the reason, two things. One, I think that that's the only thing that has made me able to survive my trauma. That loved me dearly, my grandmother, my extended family, and that I was kind of sheltered by that enclave until we left Mississippi, and I could always go back to it every summer. I think my cover story, whatever cover story I told, and I talk about that, I don't call it the cover story, but it is the story that I preferred to believe instead of having to actually deal with the trauma of her last moments, her realization that even though she thought she'd escaped, maybe, that she wasn't escaping. But your cover story really wounded me because I thought about what it would mean to not have that as not have that as a reality. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, don't be sorry. Yeah, I mean, I hope I tried to sort of make that complicated too. Like that is like that there's these different versions of the story, almost like different possibilities, and the darker possibilities of it are that the fire was like a way to, we go into Medea here, we go into like this Greek tragedies of like, would just devour the children and just like, have a new life. And, I can understand. I think it is a thing. I mean, I also quote I quote Hilary Mantel in the back of the book. There's some quotes in the back of the book somewhere if I can find them. Yeah, do I have it here? Yeah, Hilary Mantel, which is terrifying about fairy tales. There can be few mothers who, trapped with a fractious, wailing, ungrateful baby, have not wished it momentarily removed, and then become afraid of the dark powers the wish might attract.
Yeah.
Like that was the hard stuff. That was the stuff that was like really tough that, took, that sent me into like PTSD tailspins and sort of like, where the cover story sort of pulls away and there's other possibilities of like what happened. But it doesn't take away from me, like it sort of comes back in. I don't think it's a cover story anymore. I think it really contains the full complexity of it. I think it contains that there was like a lot of love, and I tried to say in here, there's long periods of like real genuinely her being a mother and doing the mother things. And here I am, I'm intact mostly at this moment, and I've sort of made it through, and I have a daughter now, and I can sort of see that there's like, how it happens. And there's moments where you're like completely connected. There's moments where you're like a million miles away. And it's, it's just, that's what life is, I think, with everyone, like that we're all like wrestling through that. Her wrestling led her to do some really risky things. I mean, her also, like, I'm not sure about with your mom, but I know like with Big Joe, a terrible choice was made, and my mother also made some very difficult choices with her love, like who she would be with, and complicated choices. And, yours turned out to be, like just devastating, that choice that your mother made is devastating. But it's just so interesting. It also is just like, that's who they were, that's who they were in some way.
But one of the things about, I think, I have to say, even the choice, it isn't that my mother chose to be in a relationship with a man who was violent and would later on kill her. That's not what she chose going into it.
Of course, yeah. I as I was saying it, I realized there was much more, like, that wasn't quite the way.
A little fraught, because it goes to all that kind of idea about like, well, she made her bed, she should lie in it. All the kind of stupid things people say about domestic violence, as if, the guy hits you on a first date and you're like, yeah, okay, I want to go with this.
Yeah. I guess I would say for like my mother, like the men she was with were, they weren't violent like that, but she was attracted to complicated men. Like my mother was attracted to complicated men, like at least 3 were in federal prison, like, before or after. I mean, including my father, my stepfather, and her last boyfriend. So it's sort of that, like, that's the interesting. It's not that anyone would deserve that, but in my case, in my mother's case, like that was sort of something I have to look at to see like that sort of wildness. She had a certain wildness to her. Which I didn't get that sense of your mother at all, actually.
No, she was the opposite. I think that's the thing. My father was the sort of the rowdiest thing, because he was a boxer also, and my mother hated that he was a boxer. She hated violence. She didn't go to watch him, but what we're talking about makes me want to read this one poem in which I try to deal with some of this stuff, because, my father grew up also in a house of domestic violence, but we saw it differently. And I think his experience of it was quite different. And so this poem, it's called Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. It's the first poem in Monument. I wrote it because I was writing Memorial Drive, and one day I just had to turn the page over. I wonder how much this happens to you, that something instead has to be a poem rather than part of the memoir, and so it poems up and you write the poem and then you go back to the memoir. I had to do this, and it was a response to all the things that people have said, including my father. So, imperatives for carrying on in the aftermath. Do not hang your head or clench your fists when even your friend, after hearing the story, says, "My mother would never put up with that." Fight the urge to rattle off statistics that, more often, a woman who chooses to leave is then murdered. The 100th time your father says, "But she hated violence. Why would she marry a guy like that?" Don't waste your breath explaining again how abusers wait, are patient, that they don't beat you on the first date, sometimes not even the first few years of a marriage. Keep an impassive face whenever you hear, "Stand by your man," and let go your rage when you recall those words were advice given your mother. Try to forget the first trial before she was dead, when the charge was only attempted murder. Don't belabor the thinking or the sentence that allowed her ex-husband's release a year later, or the juror who said, "It's a domestic issue. They should work it out themselves." Just breathe when, after you read your poems about grief, a woman asks, "Do you think your mother was weak for men?" Learn to ignore subtext. Imagine a thought cloud above your head, dark and heavy, with the words you cannot say. Let silence rain down. Remember, you were told by your famous professor that you should write about something else, unburden yourself of the death of your mother, and just pour your heart out in the poems. Ask yourself what's in your heart, that reliquary, blood locket and seed bed, and contend with what it means. The folk saying you learned from a Korean poet in Seoul, that one does not bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest, or like you carry her corpse on your back.
This came out of while you were working on Memorial Drive.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because I think one of the things I was so worried about, and I don't want to sound, domestic violence takes many shapes and forms, and people respond to it in so many different ways, and none of them should be judged for that.
Yeah.
Not the woman who goes back to her abuser, but it meant everything to me for people to understand that my mother wasn't that woman, and she's still dead.
Yeah, that's clear. I mean, the book makes that really clear. Like your mother, just the situation, like she did everything to get out of that situation, to protect herself, to, go to the right channels, and it didn't work. That's like the tragedy of it. Like, one of the tragedies of it is just that there was no that part at the end where they're recording the phone call is recorded. And it's just so clear that this is like, going to happen. Yeah.
It's like the end of your book. I loved this. It's terrifying, but also wonderful. The future love is both unwritten and inevitable.
That's the end, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll read a little passage too. I'll just read, I'm not sure if this probably doesn't speak to what you just read, but I'll read, maybe it does, it probably does. I'll read this. And again, if anyone has any questions, Yvonne's put a couple comments in, thanks Yvonne. But I'll just read a couple of, I'll read this if anyone has any questions, because we're sort of got about 15 minutes left at the most. So it's called asbestos. The word asbestos derives from the ancient Greek, meaning unquenchable or inextinguishable, which seems the opposite of how we think of it. Our house on Brook Street survived the fire, in part because the asbestos shingles repelled the flames. Here's the house, here are the flames, kept apart almost by asbestos. Asbestos makes a house seem constant, as if nothing will take it down, not termites, not fire. Can I say my mother knew it would never burn? Can I say she intentionally bought a house sheathed in asbestos across from a fire station because she knew us, would have a chance or two of being saved? One theory of the universe is that it's expanding faster than we ever believed, that it isn't constant. If we shine a light into the universe, it will go on forever. It will never find the end, because the universe isn't a bottle where light can find the wall and bounce off it. It's a structure. Its structure is what it does. It expands, so the light keeps moving farther and farther out into this endless expanse. Maybe this explains why I can never come to the end of this story, why it always seems there is more to ask. The universe is expanding. The house is on fire. No matter how long I look at it, I don't know where fire goes if it does not go back inside the match. I don't know where the child goes if he does not go back inside the mother. The house I grew up in is now filled with strangers. The furniture now holds no emptiness shaped like my mother. The youngest fireman is still on the lawn, his hose still in his hand, left to look for sparks that might still be alive. Once the flames are dead, once the sparks are silent, he will declare the house empty, but he won't check that closely. He won't see I'm still huddled inside. He won't see my mother still standing by the stove, waiting for the pie to cool. We all pass right through him.
I love that chapter. I'm glad you read it because it makes me think too about just in terms of form, the many things that are at work in the book. Your wonderful parsing of words that allows us to see so many levels of metaphor and possibility. And it's also one of the ways that you pull these threads through the whole book with not only those parsings, but the kind of repetition of phrasing, the motifs and certain images that are repeated that come back and gather steam. And I think, as in a poem that uses a refrain or repetition, it's transformed, each time it comes back.
Yeah, that's what I see in your book too. It's clearly a book written by someone who's spent their life in poetry, and just your use of, again too, your use of like white space on the page, like these sort of shocking moments where suddenly the text ends, and then suddenly there's a lot of space, and then there's a phrase that sort of like either contradicts what was said or deepens what was said or somehow complicates what was said. You have these moments that are just like, they're so, it's hard to say it's a beautiful book, but like I think it is the care and attention, the sort of like going into like a situation with like your eyes wide open, like this, and then coming back out with something, like carrying something out of it. I think it's a really loving act, and but it takes a long time to get there though, in order to be able to do that, to be able to go into it with eyes open and then come back out again.
And using those kinds of things that one might see in a poem. I feel like I mentioned this to you, but the pages where the word home is repeated for 2 or 3 pages across the bottom also is one of those kinds of topographical things that we might do in a poem. I had to ask my publisher to do that, because when they first typeset it, it came back and there weren't those spaces that I had put there. And so that was one of the things that I had to, and also even those brackets that I use, that just hold something empty inside of them. That was another sort of formal thing that I wanted to do that they were like, what? So I'm wondering if you had to contend with some of those issues about how they're going to look on the page.
Well, in this one, there are moments in here like that, it goes into a police report, an imagined police report. It goes into a couple plays in it, and each one has different formatting. So I think we do make it hard. We poets make it hard for the typesetters, because each one of those things has their own look, visual style. And in order to do that, yeah, and just to have like, I wanted to have like there's fairy tales in here that I wanted to look a certain way on the page. Yeah, and it's just a thing, by now, like I've done it a few times, like in all my books, I sort of try to do things like, because I think we're poets and it really matters to us how things look in the page. Like that's, it's not just information. It really is this material. It's a sort of, it becomes more, it has more energy to it to move this around and to figure out how to do it. There's a couple of questions. Maybe we'll take a couple of questions. Does that sound good? There's one that says, is fiction in either of your futures as well? What do you think?
Not that I know of. Only the little fictions that are embedded in the truth.
Yeah. I can imagine, like right now I can imagine some fictions. I've never been able to, and it's a really different muscle. It's a very different muscle than poetry or nonfiction. But there's something now, like this is my fourth, like, quote unquote memoir. And each one of them has like a different, I think different lens and different like concerns. I'd like to think they're not all about me, but I could see that there's a certain freedom of fiction. But I'm just really interested in like very short, very distilled fiction about like very one thing happening, like not very, I can't imagine like an epic multi-generational fiction of families, but one day. I could imagine a fiction that contained one day or something. I could imagine that, but I don't know if I'll do it though. Here's another one from Dasha. Thanks, Dasha, for the questions. I love the image of Natasha turning over the memoir page to scratch free that poem. I'm so inspired to experience both sides of your pens, poetry and prose. So I think that's like just a compliment, I guess. But yeah, it is great. Like, do you find that happens? Like when you were going between it, did many poems come out of it, or were there?
Not a lot of poems came out of it, but I was actually putting my new and selected monument together at the time.
Oh, wow.
And only writing the memoir helped me to sort of clearly see how to reshape monument, how to reshape the poems from my previous books in a new order that I think is trying also to do the work of memoir. Monument is trying to say, this is why I do it, which is why it begins with that poem.
Yeah.
Which, is my deepest wound and that kind of grief I carried. And it ends with a poem called Articulation, which is also about my mother. And it's about the dream that I had 3 weeks after she was dead, in which she says to me, do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? That's the way that Memorial Drive opens.
Yeah. So she says that, and also Lorca says it also, right? So.
Right, but when she said it in my dream,
you didn't know the Lorca.
No.
What was that like so the Lorca quote, just to remind people, is those who haven't read the book or read the Lorca quote from talking about Duende, in trying to heal the wound that never heals lies the strangeness. Mm-hmm. So that must have been quite shocking to come upon that quote after having that dream. That's like a. Yeah.
Because, and the way that and I've interpreted that dream many different ways over the years. I mean, not vastly different, but it seemed to speak to me about different moments of my life. But when I finally saw that, it seemed to me that, if you believe that you are, the dreamer is, every character in the dream, that what my mother says to me, what I say to myself, was almost the beginning of that permission to be a poet. I mean, do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? And I'll spend the rest of my life answering that question.
Yeah.
In poems.
I think, that's probably another one of our, I wonder if everyone has that. I'm not sure. Like it could be. I mean, I think it's definitely where you and I overlap. Mm-hmm. With that, but it might be true for everyone. It's possible, but maybe they don't see it, or it's not as visible, a visible wound or something.
You know, my colleague Chris Abani gave this wonderful lecture. You know, he talks,
Love Chris Abani.
isn't he great?
Yeah.
Talking about, all, writing beginning in an existential wound.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think some of us probably it's the wound is there and it's obvious, and you know what it is. I think that other people have it, but haven't worried the wound enough to know that that's actually the source of it.
Yeah, some of my younger writers get worried because they don't they feel like they haven't had enough, some bad thing happened to them yet, and all I can tell them is just wait, it'll happen. Like,
but I even think that the wound doesn't necessarily have to be some hugely traumatic.
No, it doesn't have to be hugely. No, but life is suffering. I mean, it's part of life. There's going to be some pain in this life, especially, and love is very painful. I mean, love is like opening yourself up to pain in some way. You're making yourself vulnerable, which means that, however deeply you love, that means how deeply you get hurt. So
I'm always quoting Charles Wright's introduction to Best American, in which, he says, cleverness doesn't endure, only pain endures, and the rhythms of pain.
Yeah.
Now, I think some of my younger writer students will see that and think it sounds very depressing.
We got a bunch of questions. Oh my goodness. Thanks for opening yourselves. That's just the thing. Little fictions are embedded in the truth. Someone just is caught by the little fictions that are embedded in the truth. I am caught by how Natasha's remark, and it sort of gets cut off. And then there's someone named Doug Montgomery, who's one of my oldest friends, I think, unless there's another one. Can you help refine your use of a cover story? Are they helpful? I think cover stories are helpful. I think they get you through, until you're ready to face whatever it is. I think they're essential. I think cover stories are essential. I think that's part of the whole thing. And then at some point, when in the right environment, you can maybe peel it away a little bit. Then it probably comes back again. Like, I'll probably make the same dumb jokes about my mother, like at some point, just or even, but I think it's important for us as artists to sort of go into there, to step into it and then to step out of it again and try to step into the hole.
Here's something that you wrote about cover story. As a child, I wouldn't have survived if I saw clearly the complexity of my mother's love. And so I created the story that she loved me well and that it was her love that got me through. Forrest Gander offers this. Creepy always wants to pin words on the emotional experience. Affect is precisely what the stories I've been telling myself have allowed me not to feel. By containing this emotional resonance in a story, I had an illusion of control. If I can tell the story in such a way that I find my way out of the burning house, it will prove I have some control over the chaos. If I can break into Mr. Man's house, then I can master the terror I now feel in my own house. The stories that we tell ourselves are the little fictions in the truth. Yeah.
And I do think I agree with myself, what I said there. They're essential, I think we can only, and that's the beautiful thing about the psyche. It only gives you sort of what you can handle. You can only see what you can handle. Yep. And then when you don't see it, it's a type of madness if you get more than you can handle. And then there's a crisis, then there's some sort of nervous breakdown, some sort of crisis that then you sort of hopefully get help for. We'll probably end pretty soon just because, but there's all these questions. I was terrible with the questions. I'm so sorry. Here's one. Any advice for how to move beyond the surface level story to figure out what the piece is actually about? I'm struggling with that. Therapy, maybe. This is a writer named Kate, who I've worked with before, and we're going to work with again in the fall. So I can help her with that in the fall. But do you have any advice for that?
That was the hardest thing, I think, for me when I set out to write this book, because I knew what I had experienced, but I didn't know what the story was to tell. And that's when I read Vivian Gornick's The Situation and the Story. You know, I mean, and when I did that, I could talk about the situation I was in. You know, the situation is growing up in a house of domestic violence, you know, my mother being murdered in the aftermath of our escape, and then me living in the aftermath of that. But that's not the story. And so figuring out the story was the harder thing. And, you know, I read many wonderful books to help show me how to do it. And they did it very differently. You know, I read Joan Didion and saw some of in the Year of Magical Thinking, some of my own kind of obsessive compulsive, you know, magical thinking behavior. You know, I could read Kim Barnes, you know, In the Wilderness and see that amazing lyrical way of storytelling she has in creating scenes of her family in this magical place. And I could read Nick Flynn and Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, or the reenactments, and just see how if you just focus in very precisely on some of these moments deeply and try to see them as clearly as possible, you don't have to try to fit them together as story. The story begins to emerge from it. I remember thinking, if I could just sit down and, you know, with Suck City in front of me and write those little vignettes, I didn't have to think about a linear narrative. I didn't have to think about anything. And that maybe you could just, you know, switch the order, and in doing so, the story might change, but you'd find the story from those crystalline moments.
That's beautiful. That also addresses, Valerie Wallace has a question too, which is about where did you start writing? What was your beginning? And did you find an outline useful structurally and emotionally? I think what you just said answers that question also, that just sort of like allowing these like moments, like entering into each moment as deeply as you can. And then the pattern will start emerging. Like one will start talking to the other and one will sort of suggest the next thing. I didn't do a structure before any book, but I do at some point I do a structure. I try to figure out the structure at some point, but usually I just try to gather as much as I can with as much energy around it. And then I find the structure at the end. I sort of figure out how it fits together at the end. So,
so you're always writing the pieces, the vignettes, what seems like prose poems, and then you find the order.
And then try to get a pulse.
Then you find the story.
Yeah, and try to get a pulse between them so that like there's not too much like deep subconscious work without sort of grounded imagery. So to have the pulse between the two of them was useful for this book, because there was a lot of like going in and out of like into deep psychological stuff, and then but I wanted to be grounded in, you know, being in a car and driving and things like that. We should probably end though. We've gone so long, and I think we've answered most of the questions, and this has been so great, Natasha. This is like, you know, we've been waiting 21 years to do this conversation.
I know. It's been great seeing you and talking to you and
great.
Reading this book. Thank you.
Yeah. This book. Yeah. These books. Daniel, thank you.
Yes, these books are amazing to read together, actually. And so I think you should have gotten the chat's open for me. So there are links to click on. If you purchase Nick's book, he has his unique book plate, and also we do have a signed broadside, yes. And if you get Memorial Drive, you just get an amazing book. So and maybe someday you'll get it signed. So
but you're supporting a beautiful bookstore if you do it.
Thank you. You're very kind. This is just the wall that needs to be painted, but of it. Other walls are in better shape. But we are so honored to have both of you at the virtual event. We are recording this event and we will have it ready, and everyone should be able to get it within a week, and you'll be able to share it with other people. And if one of your friends missed it, they'll also get it. Thank you to everyone who attended. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. And thank you to both of you. This was a magical conversation that I think a lot of folks will actually not just enjoy, but it will kind of, it'll seep into them and it'll come out in their own books. So thank you both.